Albertans overwhelmingly voted to reform equalization. Now, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation says this year alone, a family of four in our province paid around $2,600 in equalization payments. Many of us have had enough, especially with so many Alberta families struggling. Brian Lilley is a political reporter and a columnist for the Toronto Sun, and he joins me right now. Now, Brian, even though Albertans voted overwhelmingly to see equalization reformed, will the Trudeau Liberals even care when Premier Jason Kenney presents the findings to Trudeau?
Based on their past statements and their past actions, I would have to say the answer would probably be no. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been asked about this in the past, he has simply said, look, Jason Kenney was at the cabinet table the last time this was renegotiated, and he voted in favor of the current formula. Well, the current formula may have worked for Alberta back in, when was the last time this was done? Around 2009, 2010? But it may not work for the province now. Justin Trudeau, though, doesn't seem to care. Sure, he's picked up a couple of seats in Alberta. Is that enough to make him care about the province? Probably not. Hal, there was another issue that came up over the last week where the Elections Canada said, based on population, Alberta should get three new seats, British Columbia one additional seat in the House of Commons, Ontario an extra seat, but Quebec should lose a seat in the House of Commons
Wow.
based on population and seat redistribution, based on a formula. Quebec has said, no, we won't accept that. The Bloc has said, no, we won't accept that. The Trudeau Liberals are more likely to listen to the Bloc and the province of Quebec and say, no, you won't lose your extra seat, than they are to say, well, okay, we'll give Alberta what it wants when it comes to equalization. That's the sad reality of the situation in the province. And but I have to warn you. I don't have to warn you, but I should warn the government that failure to consider this seriously will only foster Western alienation and the rise of parties that want to say, you know what, it's time for Alberta or Alberta and Saskatchewan or Buffalo or whatever you want to call it to say enough is enough. Let's separate.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives parties like the Maverick Party that much more power, when it comes to the popular vote here in our province. Now, Brian, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently visited and paid respects to the many who lost their lives at the residential school site in Kamloops, BC. Our PM called the visit a true learning experience.
Well, unfortunately, it should have been a learning experience on September 30th. Of course, he was asked twice to go and visit Kamloops, which was, not the only residential school where we knew that there were grave sites. The fact that there were grave sites was all reported in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2016. But this was the first one where they went through using the radar technology and said, okay, we've located the grave sites. We believe that we found them. And this is an issue. So they invited them on this first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a national day of mourning, of commemoration, a holiday. I hate using that term, uh, to say you should be here. And he didn't respond. Instead, he flew past them and went to Tofino. He went on a beach vacation. I have to tell you, the dressing down that he received from Chief Roseanne Casimir was incredible to watch. The problem is that at the end, Trudeau said, well, this is a learning experience for us all. No, it was a learning experience for you. Sure, as a country, we can always do better, Hal, but the idea that every time Justin Trudeau makes a mistake, that we all have to have a learning experience, I'm sorry. No, he does. The rest of us can do better, sure, but he made the mistake. It's his learning experience. It was his comeuppance. He took it in some respects, didn't in others.
It appears as though the Trudeau Liberals continue to issue confusing messaging on travel. Why was Health Minister Patty Hajdu warning against travel just after Trudeau's trip to Tofino, BC, and then just after the election, and then apparently promoting a surfing competition with international competitors and her riding?
Hey, well, imagine that, Hal, surfing in her riding. Now, if you don't know where Patty Hajdu's riding is, she represents Thunder Bay, Ontario, the northern tip in Canada of Lake Superior. And there was a Great Lakes surfing competition in her riding. And just a week after saying that not only should we avoid non essential international travel, but that warning Canadians in a television interview that, you know what, traveling within the country, well, you can spread COVID from one community to another, and it's dangerous. She's out there promoting this surfing competition, which promotes that it draws surfers from across North America. I mean, these guys can't get their act together. We have an election at the start of a fourth wave where the fact of COVID-19 still being an issue is driven home by the Liberals on a daily basis, uh, and yet they travel the country. They hold rallies that don't respect local uh, COVID-19 regulations in terms of capacity size limits for events. They do all of these things, and then they turn around and they tell us, "Hey, don't you travel? Don't go south for the winter. Don't go visit your family. That's dangerous." It's a very confusing message, and you know, I get why people look at the government messaging and say, I'm not going to listen to them anymore because they don't believe their own hype. That's dangerous. If it's as dangerous as they say, COVID-19, and in some places it is, and in some places it's not, it really does depend on your local situation. Well, then the government messaging and their actions should match that. Currently, that isn't the case, and that's a real problem.
Brian, let's talk about the land border to the United States reopening to fully vaccinated Canadians. Even if you're fully vaccinated, however, you'll still need a negative COVID 19 test before you can re enter Canada. That's kind of interesting. Also, why did it take the Biden administration so long to reopen the border, Brian?
Well, to answer the last part of the question about why did it take so long, I think it's because Canada doesn't have the gravitas that it once did in Washington. There was a time under both conservative and liberal governments where prime minister could call a president and sort problems out. That's not the case. I know that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama both endorsed Justin Trudeau, but he doesn't really seem to have a relationship with Joe Biden. He didn't really have a good relationship with Donald Trump before him. And despite the bromance, there was nothing positive that came out of the relationship other than some photo ops with Barack Obama. So Justin Trudeau is what some people might call all hat, no cattle. He's going to look good, but he's not going to get anything done. And that's the problem on the border. Now, as for the reopening, here's the thing, Hal. If you are not vaccinated, you've still been able to fly into the United States up until now. But when they reopen the land border, that's going to change as well. Canadians flying in will have to be fully vaccinated to, if you want to visit your property in Florida, in California, in Arizona, in Texas, you're going to have to be fully vaccinated and you'll have to show that negative test. Now, if you're flying in, you'll need a negative test to get into the United States and a negative test to come back into Canada. Driving, you won't need that. So, however you're traveling down, make sure that if you are headed south, and I can tell you, I think my mother started packing the car the night that the news broke. Um, Make sure that you know what the rules are for how you're traveling, where you're crossing the border, and what the rules will be when you get there. Because just like our rules vary province by province, their rules vary state by state. So if you're heading to Palm Springs, it's going to be a different set of rules than if you're heading to Phoenix or to somewhere in West Texas.
Brian, another cross border issue is brewing, the push for Buy American provisions. Some would call it protectionism. Now, this could potentially cut Canada out of future auto industry investment here in North America.
Yeah, just like the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline was in many ways a protectionist measure under both Obama and the Biden administrations, so too is this move to say, you know what, we want to move um, auto manufacturing, auto facilities back into the United States. And so the Biden administration is pushing forward with a budget bill called the Build Back Better Act. Now, you know, just like in Canada, spending bills have to originate in the lower house. So they originate in Congress, but it's sponsored by a Democrat out of Kentucky. And it includes in their almost 2,500 pages, it includes a provision that says you will get up to $12,500 back if you buy an electric vehicle, as long as most of the parts in that vehicle are made in the United States and the battery is made in the United States. Now, that's important because Ontario is in the middle of pushing to be a battery, electric vehicle battery manufacturing hub. Inside Canada and mostly inside Ontario, we've got all the raw components. We've got the lithium, we've got the cobalt, the mining operations are here to get the raw materials, and there's a strong auto manufacturing sector here. But the United States wants to make sure that all those jobs end up down south. So if you follow US politics, you know that back in 2009, before the bailout was fully announced, Biden tried this back then. He tried to team up with the United Auto Workers to move all of the auto jobs in North America into the United States. And it was only because the Harper government at the time and the McGuinty government here in Ontario ponied up some cash that we kept any auto manufacturing jobs in this country. Joe Biden is an extreme protectionist. If you thought Donald Trump was bad on protectionism, and whether you loved Donald Trump or hated him, the man wanted jobs in America. Joe Biden is even worse when it comes to protectionist policies, and yet Canadians love him. He is going to hurt this country's economy in every single sector where we rely on access to American or international markets.
Let's also talk about pipelines, if you want to talk about the Biden administration and Canadian pipelines. Brian, Ottawa's unveiled its mandatory vaccination policy, and despite the tough rhetoric from the Prime Minister, you say this policy is a mess with a lot of holes in it. Can you explain?
Well, I mean, if you listen to Justin Trudeau during the election, he was the only person that could protect Canadians from COVID, because anybody else, I mean, they're going to allow testing. How? They're going to not make sure every single civil servant is vaccinated. And if that doesn't happen, we'll all get COVID and we'll all die. I mean, that was kind of the message that Justin Trudeau was pushing. It was a very alarmist message. And then when you look at his actual policy, okay, well, despite the fact that he says exemptions will be exceedingly rare and difficult to get, well, no, you can easily get a medical exemption. You can get a religious exemption. You can get all kinds of exemptions to this policy. Beyond that, it only applies to what is called the core public administration. So, to give you an example that everyone can understand, if you work for Finance Canada, the Department of Finance under Minister Chrystia Freeland, well, then this vaccination policy applies to you. If you work for the Canada Revenue Agency, it doesn't apply to you. It's an agency that is technically outside of the government. Same with Parks Canada, Canada Food Inspection Agency, and many others. So there's tens and tens of thousands of employees that this doesn't apply to. Beyond that, you've got, if you're a full-time government employee that this policy does apply to, you don't have to show proof. I mean, if you live in Ottawa, you have to show a vaccine certificate to sit and eat in a local restaurant. Anywhere near Parliament Hill, you've got to show that in Ontario or Quebec. If you work for the federal government, you just have to sign an attestation that you've been vaccinated. So you could just lie and say, oh, yeah, I've been vaccinated, sign the form, send it in. If you're a contractor that works for an employment agency, you have to show proof. And if you're a cleaner that goes into any of these federal buildings, whether the employees are required to be vaccinated or not, you have to be fully vaccinated. So there are exemptions and holes and all of these problems going on. But here's the real kicker, Hal. It doesn't apply to MPs or senators or their staff. They're all exempt. And by the way, most civil servants in Ottawa, where the majority of them reside, are working from home.
Wow. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is set to unveil his new cabinet next Tuesday. Now let's talk about the fact that MPs received a big raise this year will not be returning to the House of Commons until November the 22nd. Why is that?
That's because the Trudeau administration, the Trudeau government, does not like sitting in the House of Commons. There was a piece out the other day that showed that they have been sitting fewer and fewer days, and not just because of COVID. I think prior to COVID, the year prior to COVID, the House of Commons only sat 75 days. This is a pattern with this government that says they don't like the checks and balances that Parliament provides. So, yes, we're going to see the cabinet next week, but we won't see them in action until November the 22nd. They'll sit for about 3, maybe 4 weeks. Then they will, according to the current schedule, be gone until January 31st. Now, I'm not one of these people that says an MP is only working if they're in their House of Commons, and if they're not in the House of Commons, then they're on vacation. Any MP that isn't working their riding on a regular basis, showing up at events, solving problems for constituents, is not going to get reelected. But we were told that we had to have this election because there were serious problems that needed a serious government, and they needed a mandate, and they needed to get to work. Well, then, why are you waiting 2 months? This is the third administration for the Trudeau government. They're not new at it. I looked at the record. In both his second and third terms, Stephen Harper recalled Parliament within a month. He had his cabinet sworn in within 2 weeks and had Parliament back at work within a month. Justin Trudeau's taking 2 months. MPs will have been gone for almost 6 months by the time the House of Commons comes back.
And maybe another discussion someday we can talk about the nice pension that MPs will also receive. Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time again today.
Thank you, Hal.